The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the quiet church as rain pattered gently against the stained glass windows. Inside, the world felt hushed, a stark contrast to the storm outside. It was here, on an old wooden pew near the altar, that the little girl slept, curled up like a tiny bird seeking refuge from the cold. Her clothes were tattered, her face smudged with dirt, and her arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to stay warm. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, but the weight of the world already seemed to press heavily on her small shoulders. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching. They were quiet, deliberate, almost hesitant. A man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, paused at the entrance of the church. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man whose presence commanded attention wherever he went. A self-made millionaire, he had built his fortune from nothing, turning his humble beginnings into a sprawling empire of businesses. Yet, despite his wealth and success, something always felt missing, a void he could never quite fill, no matter how much he achieved. Daniel had come to the church that evening seeking solace. It wasn't his usual routine, but something had drawn him there, a strange pull he couldn't explain. As he stepped inside, the sight of the sleeping girl stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he thought she might be a statue, part of the church's decor, but then he saw her shiver. His heart, hardened by years of business deals and life's battles, softened in an instant. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. The girl stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal wide, frightened eyes. She sat up quickly, clutching the edge of the pew as if ready to run. "It's okay," Daniel said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl didn't reply. She just stared at him, her small body tense and wary. Daniel knelt down to her level, his voice softening even more. "What's your name?" he asked. For a moment, she didn't answer, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Finally, she whispered, "Leela." Daniel smiled. "Leela, that's a beautiful name. How long have you been here?" She hesitated again before answering, her voice barely audible. "A few days, I think." Daniel's chest tightened. A few days. How could a child be left all alone for that long? He glanced around the empty church, as if expecting someone to appear and explain everything. But there was no one. Just him, Leela, and the dim light of the candles. "Where are your parents?" he asked cautiously. Leela shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't have any," she murmured. Those words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had grown up without much, but at least he had a family, however flawed they were. The thought of this little girl having no one to turn to, no one to care for her, was unbearable. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. Leela shook her head again, this time looking down at her hands, which were dirty and scratched. "I stay here," she said simply. "It's safe." Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He didn't know what to do. This wasn't something he had planned for. But as he looked at Leela, so small and vulnerable, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just walk away and leave her there, not in good conscience. "Leela," he said softly, "how would you feel about coming with me? Just for tonight. I'll make sure you're safe, and we can figure things out in the morning." Her eyes darted to his, wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel paused, searching for the right words. "Because no one should have to sleep alone in a church," he said finally, "and because I want to help." The silence between them felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Leela looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a second, Daniel thought she might refuse, that she might retreat further into herself. But then she gave the smallest of nods. "Okay," she whispered. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of responsibility. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but something told him it was the right thing to do. He stood and held out his hand. Leela hesitated for a moment before placing her tiny, cold hand in his. The gesture felt fragile, like a delicate thread connecting two vastly different worlds. As they stepped out into the rain, Daniel's mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? Where had she come from? And why did he feel so compelled to help her? He didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This encounter was about to change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. The rain poured harder as they walked toward his car, the sound of the storm echoing around them. Daniel glanced down at Leela, who was clutching his hand tightly, her small frame trembling from the cold. "It's going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to her. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a story he hadn't planned for, but one that might finally fill the void he had carried for so long. What Daniel didn't know was that Leela carried her own secrets that would unravel as their lives intertwined. And as the church doors closed behind them, it felt as though the past and future were colliding in a way neither of them could escape. As Daniel drove through the quiet streets, his eyes occasionally flicked to the rearview mirror. Leela sat in the back seat, bundled in his coat, her small frame barely filling the space. She stared out the window, her face unreadable, but her fingers played nervously with the edge of the fabric. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but he didn't know where to start. What could he say to a child who had been through more than anyone her age should ever have to endure? The city lights reflected in the rain-streaked windows as they passed towering skyscrapers and bustling intersections. Daniel realized how starkly different their worlds were. For him, this city had been a place of opportunity, where his ambition and hard work had built him a life of luxury. For Leela, it was a cold and unforgiving place, one where survival was a daily battle. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing how easily he had ignored the struggles of people like her before tonight. When they arrived at his home, Leela's eyes widened as she looked up at the sprawling mansion. The tall gates, perfectly manicured lawn, and glowing windows made it seem like a place from a fairy tale. Daniel opened the car door and offered his hand, but she hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the house. "Is this where you live?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "Yes," Daniel said, kneeling to meet her eye level. "But for tonight, it's where you'll stay too. You don't have to be afraid, okay?" She nodded slowly, but her grip on his hand was tentative as he led her inside. The warmth of the house enveloped them, a sharp contrast to the cold rain outside. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla. Leela's footsteps echoed softly as she followed Daniel through the grand entryway. He showed her to a guest room, a cozy space with soft lighting, a plush bed, and a small armchair by the window. Leela stood in the doorway, her eyes darting around as if she couldn't believe it was real. "You can sleep here tonight," Daniel said gently. "There's a bathroom just through that door. If you're hungry, I can make you something to eat." Leela hesitated before stepping into the room. She ran her fingers over the edge of the bed, her expression a mix of wonder and disbelief. "This is all for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "Yes, you're safe here, Leela. You don't have to worry about anything." She looked at him, her big eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, but also fear. She didn't say anything more, just nodded and sat on the edge of the bed. Daniel watched her for a moment before stepping out, giving her space to adjust. As he walked back to the kitchen, his mind raced with questions. Who was Leela? Where had she come from? And why had she been left all alone? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she had let on. He needed answers, but he also knew he couldn't push her too hard, not yet. The next morning, Leela was quiet but polite as she ate the breakfast Daniel had prepared. She seemed more at ease than the night before, though she still avoided his gaze. Daniel decided to take things slow, to let her open up in her own time. But as the days passed, he began to notice little things about her, how she flinched at loud noises, how she avoided certain questions, how she always seemed to be on edge, as if expecting something bad to happen. It wasn't until a week later that he finally learned a piece of the truth. They were sitting in the garden, Leela drawing with a set of colored pencils Daniel had bought her. She was quiet as usual, focused on her work, but when Daniel asked about her drawing, a picture of a small house with flowers around it, her face darkened. "That's where I used to live," she said softly. Daniel leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Can you tell me about it?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pencil. It was just me and my mom, she said after a long pause. We didn't have much, but we were happy. Until her voice trailed off, and she looked down, her eyes brimming with tears. Until what, Leela? Daniel asked gently. She shook her head, wiping her eyes quickly. She got sick, she whispered. Really sick. We didn't have money for doctors. And then she was gone. Just like that. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched her struggle to hold back tears. I'm so sorry, Leela, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She sniffled, hugging her knees to her chest. After she died, I didn't know what to do. No one came to help. I tried to stay in the house, but they said I couldn't be there alone, so I left. Her words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He couldn't imagine the pain and fear she must have felt, being forced to fend for herself at such a young age. And yet, here she was, surviving against all odds. I wish I could have been there to help you, he said softly. Leela looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. But you're here now, she said quietly. Her words lingered in Daniel's mind long after their conversation ended. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future for both of them. He decided then and there that he would do whatever it took to give Leela the life she deserved. A life filled with love, safety, and opportunities she had never known. But just as Daniel began to feel hopeful, things took an unexpected turn. One evening, as he and Leela were having dinner, there was a knock at the door. When Daniel opened it, he found a woman standing there, her face pale and drawn. I'm looking for my daughter, she said, her voice trembling. Her name is Leela. Daniel froze, his mind racing. This woman, who was she? And what did her sudden arrival mean for the fragile bond he and Leela had begun to build? The tension in the air was almost unbearable as Leela peeked around the corner, her face going pale when she saw the woman. Daniel looked between them, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of a new and even more complicated chapter in their story. Daniel's heart raced as he stood frozen at the door, staring at the woman who claimed to be Leela's mother. Behind him, he could feel Leela's presence, quiet and small, hiding in the shadows of the hallway. For a moment, all he could hear was the heavy silence stretching between them. Finally, he found his voice, steady but cautious. Who are you, and how you know Leela? The woman took a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. My name is Clara, she said, her voice trembling. I've been searching for my daughter for months. She went missing after everything fell apart. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked past Daniel, spotting Leela standing hesitantly behind him. Leela, it's me, she said, her voice cracking. It's Mom. Leela's small frame stiffened. She didn't move closer, but her wide, fearful eyes locked onto Clara. You're not my mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You left me. Clara flinched as if the words had physically struck her. She stepped forward, desperation in her voice. I didn't leave you, sweetheart. I was taken away. Things got so bad after your father, after he hurt us. I had no choice but to leave, but I never stopped looking for you. I swear. Daniel turned to Leela, who stood frozen, her face a mix of anger and confusion. Leela, he said gently, kneeling down to her level. Do you recognize her? Is she telling the truth? Tears welled up in Leela's eyes as she stared at Clara, studying her face as if trying to remember. She looks like my mom, she admitted softly, her voice shaking. But my mom wouldn't have left me. My mom loved me. I do love you, Clara said, stepping closer. More than anything in the world, I've been through so much to find you. Please, just let me explain. Daniel could see the turmoil in Leela's eyes. She wanted to believe Clara, but the pain of abandonment was still fresh, still raw. Daniel stood and turned to Clara, his protective instincts kicking in. If what you're saying is true, you owe Leela an explanation, he said firmly. But she's been through enough. This has to happen on her terms. Clara nodded quickly, tears streaming down her face. Of course, she said. I just want her to know the truth. I want her to understand that I never meant to hurt her. Reluctantly, Leela sat down in the living room, clutching a cushion to her chest as Clara began to speak. She told them everything. how her marriage had turned abusive, how she had tried to shield Leela from the worst of it, and how, one terrible night, she had been forced to flee for her life. She had planned to come back for Leela, but the legal system had failed her, and she had spent months trying to track her daughter down, only to find that Leela had disappeared as well. Leela listened quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as the pieces of her past began to fall into place. "I thought you didn't love me anymore," she said in a small voice. "Oh, sweetheart, no," Clara said, kneeling in front of her. "You are my whole world. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. But I'm here now, and I'll never leave you again, I promise." The room fell silent as Leela processed everything. Finally, she reached out and wrapped her arms around Clara, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Clara held her tightly, sobbing quietly into her hair. Daniel watched the reunion from the corner of the room, a strange mix of emotions washing over him. He felt relief that Leela had found her mother, but also a pang of sadness at the thought of letting her go. Over the weeks, she had become a part of his life, and the idea of saying goodbye felt harder than he'd expected. Later that evening, after Leela had gone to bed, Daniel and Clara sat in the living room, talking quietly. Clara thanked him repeatedly for taking care of Leela, for giving her a safe place to stay when she had no one else. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," she said sincerely. "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "Leela is an incredible kid. She's brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing." He paused, his gaze distant. "But I think she needs you more than anything right now. You're her family." Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I'll never forget what you've done for her. For us," she said. The next few days were bittersweet as Daniel prepared to say goodbye to Leela. He helped Clara set up a safe, stable home for her, ensuring they had everything they needed to start over. On the morning of their departure, Leela hugged Daniel tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "I'll never forget you." Daniel smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "You take care of yourself, Leela. And if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." As he watched them drive away, a deep sense of fulfillment settled over him. He had stepped into Leela's life at a time when she needed someone the most. And though their time together had been brief, it had changed both of their lives forever. In the weeks that followed, Daniel returned to his usual routines, but something was different. He found himself more aware of the people around him, more attuned to the struggles that often went unnoticed. Helping Leela had opened his heart in a way he hadn't expected, and he carried that experience with him as a reminder of what truly mattered in life. And though Leela was no longer in his home, she was always in his heart. The story of a millionaire and a little homeless girl wasn't just about one life-changing moment. It was a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and second chances. It reminded Daniel, and anyone who heard it, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest ripple effects, transforming lives in ways no one could have ever imagined.